Hello, welcome to Exclam Chess. In this video, I'll be showing how all of the pieces move. We'll start with pawns. Pawns can only move in one direction, forward, and they can only move one square at a time, except on their initial move when they can move two squares if they would like. Pawns make captures diagonally, which means that this pawn here controls these two squares. So now that this pawn has just moved here, the white pawn can make a capture if it would like. Pawns also have a special move called En Passant, which is French for en passing. It means that if your opponent's pawn uses its two-square advance to pass through a square that your pawn controls, you can still make that capture. If the black pawn advances using its two-square advance, since this pawn controls this square that the black pawn has just passed through, the white pawn can still capture it. Pawns also have another special ability called pawn promotion, which means that if this white pawn makes it to your opponent's back rank, it can become any piece of your choosing, except a king, obviously. Most of the time people will choose a queen, since the queen is the most powerful piece. There are times, however, when it's a good idea to under-promote it to either a rook, a bishop, or in some cases a knight. And that covers pawns. Now we'll move on to knights. Knights move very differently when compared to the other pieces. They move sort of in an L shape. A knight can move two squares up and one to either side, or it can move one square up and two to the side. Also, when knights move, they jump over pieces. This means that even though the knight is completely blocked in by all of its pieces, it can still go to any square that it normally would be able to go to. Since knights jump over pieces, this also means that they can only make captures on the square that they land on. If this knight were to capture this pawn, it can't capture this pawn because it jumped over it, so this pawn stays on the board. Now we'll move on to bishops. At the beginning of the game, you're given two bishops. One bishop starts on a light square, one bishop starts on a dark square. They can't move off of the color they start on throughout the entire game. So this bishop will always stay on light squares, and this bishop will always stay on dark squares. A bishop moves diagonally, and they can move as far along a diagonal as they would like. They only have to stop moving along the diagonal if they go to make a capture. Next, we'll move on to the rook. The rook is easy to learn. It moves horizontally and vertically, being able to move as many squares as it would like in either one of those directions. The only time it would have to stop is to make a capture. Now we'll move on to the queen. The queen is the most powerful piece on the board. She can move in any direction as far as she'd like. She can move vertically, horizontally, diagonally, making her the most powerful piece on the board. She only has to stop moving if she'd like to make a capture. Last, we'll talk about the king. Despite being the most important piece of the game, the king can only move one square at a time, and he can do so in any direction. He can move vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. The king also has a special move when combined with the rook, called castling. During castling, the king moves 2 squares towards the rook, and the rook comes out on the other side. The king can also castle to the other side. 2 squares to the side, and the rook coming out on the other side. There are a few restrictions to castling. The king can't have moved during the game, or the rook can't have moved on the side that the king is trying to castle to. Also, the king can't be in check. Since the rook is putting the king in check, the king can't castle. He also couldn't castle if the rook were here, since another rule is the king can't castle through check. If he were to castle now, he would be castling through the line that the black rook controls, and would be passing through a check. The king also can't castle into check, which means if the rook were here, the king wouldn't be able to castle, since he would be putting his king in check. The exception is if the rook is attacked. Here the bishop is attacking the rook, but the king can still castle, since it's only the rook that it's attacked, not the king. It's also okay for the king to castle if the rook passes through a square that another piece controls. Since the bishop is only attacking this square that the rook passed through, the king could still castle to that side of the board.